Hi everybody, and welcome to yet another installment of our video series for ENR 3200 Environmental and Natural Resources Policy. This week we are discussing the role that governmental agencies play in implementing public policies that have an impact on the environment. Remember, implementation is always key to the success of policies. You can have the best looking policies on paper, but really policies are only as good as their implementation. Now, for agencies to successfully implement policies, many times they need to create specific regulations. And to do this, they need access to expert advice. As you can imagine, scientists are the ultimate source of this type of advice. So in this video, I'll share an interview with Dr. Robin Wilson, who is a full professor at the School of Environment and Natural Resources here at The Ohio State University. Dr. Wilson is a highly accomplished scientist who specializes in the study of how individuals make decisions under conditions of risk and uncertainty. Back in 2016, she started serving in the Environmental Protection Agency's Science Advisory Board, also known as SAB. But after the change of presidential administrations, she was removed from the board in 2017 in a process that was quite controversial. She's going to talk to us about how all that unfolded. Before that, I just want to say a few things about the EPA Science Advisory Board. What is it? Well, this board was created in 1978 by congressional mandate, and its mission is to provide scientific advice to the EPA's administrator, who's the main authority of the agency, as you know by now. The board is authorized to do a few things. It can review the quality and relevance of scientific and technical information being used by the EPA to create regulations, but it can do other things too, like review the agency's research programs and plans as needed, and also advise the agency on scientific matters in general. There are currently 44 members of the board, and they come from a variety of organizational backgrounds, including universities, state governmental agencies, consulting firms, think tanks, business associations, and even individual companies that are regulated by the agency, which makes a lot of people a little bit uncomfortable, right? With the change of presidential administrations in the year 2016, there have been some important changes in the board composition. But if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you're going to have to keep watching this video, which is about to get much more interesting. So without further ado, here she is, Dr. Robin Wilson.
I was nominated for the Science Advisory Board. I don't even know by who, honestly. So I received a phone call or an email probably in late 2015 or early 2016 from some of the staff at the EPA that run the board, asking if I would be interested, that I was nominated. They go through a vetting process every fall where people can be nominated, and then they select people from that pool of nominees. So someone had nominated me. They contacted me and asked if I was interested, went through kind of like an interview, but just kind of, getting to know me more and my expertise and where that would fit into the kind of composition of the board. And then essentially I was selected from that process. So the first year when I was serving, it was a lot of just getting up to speed on how things work and really developing like my own personal comfort level with engaging in the conversations. And so when I was placed into that position, there was several kind of ongoing panels and reports being developed. And again, a lot of them were kind of topics that weren't really in my area of expertise, but I was there as a decision scientist to kind of bring that perspective to the conversations. And so it was a lot of just kind of getting up to speed on where they were in developing these reports, like where in the process the panels were that were reviewing the science and answering the charge questions from the agency. And then what would happen is there would be a chair of each of those panels who was a member of the board. And so at our meetings, we would often get updates from those chairs of kind of, this is where we are, this is how we're summarizing state of the science in response to each of these questions, this is where we're getting held up. So a lot of that year was me kind of, hearing those processes, and then in those board meetings, like weighing in if there was something that I felt like I could respond to. There was also a lot of engagement with the agency. So not only are there staff that would run our meetings and we'd be involved in, but we had a lot of other folks from the agency coming in, talking about initiatives at the agency, basically seeking out the advice, kind of unsolicited advice of the board. So there's certain things the agency has to come to us for, and then they can come to us for anything else they want, right? So it was pretty exciting, and it was fun, again, to get that kind of inner glimpse of the agency. And then when President Trump was elected, it all just stopped. So basically, we were cut out of all conversations. Our work started to dry up, I think is the way that our chair phrased it, said that, they'll come to us if they have to, but they're not coming to us unless they have to. And so that second year, again, I only served about 9 months. It was a very different sort of structure. We were still kind of plugging away at existing projects, existing reports, running existing panels, but there was very little interaction. And in fact, when Scott Pruitt was named the administrator of the EPA, what typically happens, the administrator comes and meets with the board, has a conversation with us, spends some time with us, and we kept inviting him to come, and he wouldn't even come. It was pretty early in that year, I want to say spring, summer, where we started to hear that Administrator Pruitt was potentially going to develop a policy to rethink the composition of the board. And so again, pretty early on, we started seeing changes, not just potential changes in the Science Advisory Board, but changes in other advisory boards within the EPA. So it was as early as spring, I would say, of 2017, where people were being removed from boards in ways that, again, was not typical for the way that board members are appointed and the way they serve terms. So you typically serve a 3-year term, and you can serve 2 consecutive terms, and then you have to go off. And you could come back on a year later if someone would nominate you, but you can only do 2 consecutive terms. And so it was, the status quo was typically someone would serve their 3-year term and typically be nominated again or kind of reappointed for another term. But what was happening in spring of 2017 was, as people were ending their initial term, they were being removed and replaced with new people. And I think it was probably sometime kind of late summer that I actually got a phone call from a reporter at the Washington Post who said, hey, do you know anything about these changes that are happening to advisory boards? And we hear that there's this directive that might come out where if you have funding from the agency, you won't be able to serve on a board anymore. And that was new, like that wasn't part of the removal of people in the spring. The removal in spring was just kind of not allowing people to serve a second term. And it was funny because I said, yeah, I actually had heard of it, but I just kind of assumed those of us already on the board would be maybe grandfathered in. But then it wasn't long after that Pruitt came out with this directive that basically said if you have any sort of funding from the agency, it's considered a conflict of interest. But the assumption all of us had when that directive came out is they did not believe that scientists who were receiving funding from the agency could be objective, because we would somehow want to be in good with the agency so that we could keep our funding or get future funding, and that if we found something in our science, right, or through those projects that didn't speak well to the agency or didn't reflect well on what the agency was doing, that we wouldn't want to be honest about that, or we wouldn't want to share that. So it was this, again, assumed that because we're receiving money in some form from the agency, we could then not be trusted to be objective in the way we would provide science advice. So it was a bit offensive to hear that. And then I think what called it into question for everyone, that made it look like a thinly veiled attempt to get rid of people, was that many of us were then being replaced by industry scientists, and industry scientists who are regulated by the EPA. And so suddenly my $75,000 is too big of a conflict to be independent in terms of giving scientific advice. But someone who works for, say, the fossil fuel industry, where millions or billions of dollars are at stake when it comes to agency decisions, there's no question of objectivity. So that inconsistency is really what I think drew a lot of red flags for people, because it's one thing to say there are financial conflicts of interest. It's another to target it at university scientists who have little tiny grants that are short-lived versus industry scientists who are representing, a sector with huge financial interests when it comes to what the agency is doing. I got an email from one of the staff members on the board, and it was just kind of like a 2-sentence, it was a very short email, and it just said, I believe you're aware of the new directive, thank you for your service. That was like it. And so I remember thinking like, oh, okay. And I just kept it in my inbox for a couple of days because I wanted to reply, but I didn't really know what to say to it. And it didn't provide a lot of, detail or kind of like, your service ends now. And then it was a phone call or email from a friend, probably a couple days after I got that email that pointed me towards a blog post that had come out from a lawyer at Columbia that runs their kind of environmental law center. And he had written this blog post and basically said, if you're someone who's been targeted by this directive about objectivity and conflicts of interest, you should refuse to step down. And he gave kind of a legal argument for why this directive was basically illegal, like definitely unethical, but probably illegal. And that it was kind of overstepping the power of the administrator to control the boards in this way. And so I was like, oh, great. So I just immediately kind of fired back an email and said, yes, I'm aware of it, but, I refuse to step down. I think this is questionable. And, if Mr. Pruitt feels so strongly about this, then he's welcome to fire me. But I would like to be fired because when you get appointed, you get this very formal letter from the administrator, there's these processes in place. And so I said, the 2-sentence email doesn't feel right to me. So if he's serious about this, then he can go on record doing this. I was then contacted by this lawyer at Columbia, and they wanted to sue the agency, put together a lawsuit pointing out the kind of illegal nature of that directive and fighting against that. And then it was interesting because our lawsuit went public. And then kind of end of December, I want to say it was right around Christmas, I got a letter from Administrator Pruitt that said it was a very standard kind of thank you for your service sort of letter, and others who were ending a term also got one. But mine had an extra sentence in it, and it said thank you for your service, which ended on, and it had like a date, and it was sometime in December. So I took that as my like firing letter because it was like adding that little piece to the form letter for everyone ending their terms on the board. Initially, the judge ruled with the agency, and they had to appeal, so it just went through a long process. And then just recently, they received a ruling that it was deemed illegal and that directive couldn't be held in place. So that just happened like in the spring. So I'm curious because the nomination process is coming up here, starting about now, and they'll be making those decisions. And so I'm curious to see what actually happens if people with funding are nominated, if they're selected, because hypothetically, and I no longer have funding, my project ended in January, but hypothetically, even someone with funding should be able to be chosen for the board. I imagine over my lifetime, I have transformed my view, or I'm sure at one point I had a very naive, optimistic view where as someone interested in the environment and studying environmental science, and that science drives policy as it should, and that we should be making decisions, whatever they are, regulatory, deregulatory, or resource management, right, in line with what the science says is best for whatever the end goal is, right, environmental health, public health. So I think I probably started at some point in my kind of academic career thinking, oh, that's how that works, right? Agencies are full of objective scientists who are able to do the right thing. Well, the leads of these agencies are appointed by an administration that has a political agenda. It's very standard as like an administration shifts from Republican to Democrat that they're going to come in and want to try to overturn a bunch of things and switch things back. But it has felt a lot stronger this time, where there's just been a lot of kind of undo anything that was done by the prior administration. I think I realized that these sort of shifts can be much more impactful than perhaps I realized before.